When my mother died in 2022, I inherited, amongst other things, a collection of old documents, photos, and other items which had once belonged to my grandfather. I always knew him as Pop, but his real name was George Lionel Kellaway, affectionately known as Trot by his friends. I'm not exactly sure why he was given this nickname, but I'm guessing that because he was quite short, he probably had to trot to keep up with his taller friends. Being quite short myself, I remember my friends also being amused that I had trouble keeping up with them on a brisk walk. Anyway, I had always known that Pop had fought in the Great War, and I remember as a young boy trying to get him to tell me about the war. But he never did. He preferred to sit me on his knee and read the Farmer's Weekly to me. My mother explained that Pop had had a bad time in the war and didn't like to talk about it, like many others of that generation. He just wanted to forget it. In fact, he could never forget it. For starters, his leg wound wouldn't let him, and continued to trouble him for the rest of his life. Nor with the nightmares, where he would wake screaming, believing he was back, fighting for his life, in the trenches of Salonika. Those memories would haunt him until the day he died. As for me, my curiosity of Pop's involvement in World War I had also never gone away. I wanted to put together the pieces of the jigsaw and find out as much as I could about Pop's experiences of that tumultuous time in world history. I wanted to discover where he had gone, in which battles he had fought, and tried to imagine what he had gone through, and then to set it down on record in such a way that future generations would be able to catch a glimpse of a time when so many young men, like my grandfather, were prepared to sacrifice everything, even their lives, for justice, king, and country. So, this is my humble attempt to do just that, to tell his tale, which I think deserves to be told. As you can see from this family tree, Pop was born in 1895 in Abbotsbury, where his father was a tenant farmer, and his mother had been a school teacher at the village school of Fleet. Pop's father, George, must have been a very hard-working and successful farmer. His father, John, was listed as an agricultural labourer in 1861. George was born in 1862, and by 1891 he is listed as being a farmer at Abbotsbury. But he and his wife, Mary, were lodgers at Manor Farm, Langton Herring. Shortly after Pop was born, the family moved to Froome Church near Maiden Newton to take on the farm tenancy of Crookston. I think this is probably where this photo was taken. Pop is in the centre. He looks about 5 or 6 at the time. He's with his mother, father, and elder brother John, or Jack. This is a picture of Crookston around the time Pop would have been growing up. It was, and is still today, a beautiful old historic farmhouse. In the 1901 census, Pop, or George, is listed as 6 years old, along with his brothers, John, Jack, who's 9, and Archie, 3. Interestingly, Archie is listed as being born at Maiden Newton, so the family must have been living here since at least 1898. The census lists numerous agricultural labourers, carters, shepherds, a dairyman, a gardener, and servants, all employed at Crookston. Pop's father, George, still not not yet 40, had certainly done well for himself, given that he'd been born the son of a farm labourer. However, I suspect that his wife Mary, the ex-schoolmistress, had played no small part in her husband's success and meteoric rise in the world. It was almost certainly Pop's mother, Mary, who would have insisted that her children got the best education that they could afford. So, rather than relying on the local school at Maiden Newton, young George was sent to Weymouth for his schooling. Weymouth, as you can see from the postcards of the time, was a bustling, fashionable seaside resort, and would have been quite an exciting and fun place to attend school. I think Pop must have quite enjoyed his time in Weymouth, as he always loved to go down to the seaside. Later in life he would keep a rowing boat down at nearby Osmington, where he would go to unwind and eat lobster for tea at the Picnic Inn, which is now called the Smugglers. Young George was sent to a private boarding school called Weymouth College. This is a description of the school which appeared in a 1929 guide to private schools in England. From the description you get the feeling that Pop's parents may already have been thinking that Pop's career lay outside of farming. It notes, the college definitely prepares boys for the universities, the army and the navy, the civil service and other professions. It also had an OTC, or Officer Training Corps, which young George would certainly have been enrolled in. I'm guessing that it was at this time that Pop gained his enduring and endearing nickname of Trot. Weymouth College closed as a private school in 1940 and has since been converted to flats. When Trot finished school, he was sent to London, where apparently, according to my mother, he started to train as an auctioneer. This must have been around 1912 or so. I'm not sure who he was training with or where he lived in London, but it certainly must have been a dramatic change for a boy who had up to now spent all his life in Dorset. The fact is, though, that an even more dramatic change was about to happen in Trot's life. In 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Young men flocked to join up. And in 1915, Trot would have seen the first Zeppelin starting to drop bombs on London. The social pressure on young men like Trot to join up was relentless. Even the women were starting to tell the men to go. In January 1916, the British government introduced conscription, so now there was no choice in the matter. Trot probably enlisted early in the spring of that year. But as he marched away, Trot had other, more worrying concerns. His mother was seriously unwell. As Trot said his goodbyes, I wonder if he realised that he would never see her again. She was dying and probably had cancer. She passed away on 6th of June 1916. She was only 57. Mary was buried in the little church at Froomvo Church, just a stone's throw from the farm at Crookston. You can still see her grave today, although the inscription is not so easy to decipher. Trot's father, George, who died in 1928, is buried alongside her. Trot enlisted in a London regiment, the Artists' Rifles, a regiment which was popular with other young professionals, as well as artists such as John Nash and writers like Wilfred Owen, who he would have rubbed shoulders with. He was sent to Hare Hall camp at Romford, Essex, to train as an officer. Because Trot had attended a public school which had had an officer training corps or an OTC, he would have had little trouble in being accepted to train as an officer cadet. The army was also getting particularly short of officers as the casualty rate in France mounted. Amazingly, I still have Trot's cap that he would have worn at Hare Hall. It's a little moth-eaten now, but there is the artist's rifle's cap badge, still in place, as it was well over 100 years ago. This photo was probably taken in the summer of 1916. Trot is shown here with some of his messmates. He's on the right, holding a cigarette. Another photo, taken with fellow officer cadets. Trot is seen here on the left, sitting smoking a pipe. I can't help but wonder how many of his friends shown here made it through the war. The average life expectancy of a young officer at this time was no more than 6 weeks. In fact, such was the mortality rate of young officers at this time that, according to Sir John French in his preface to the War Memorial Book of the Artist's Rifles, the regiment had earned itself the nickname of the Suicide Club. To gain a commission, an officer cadet needed to demonstrate that he had a good knowledge of the following: discipline, drill, musketry, tactics and warfare, topography, billeting, machine guns, interior economy, military law, signalling, and trench warfare. Under these headings there would be numerous subsections. For example, in trench warfare, the officer needed to have a good knowledge of bombs and explosives, common types of trenches, dugouts, entanglements and obstacles, construction, repair, holding and capture of trenches, training and employment of grenadiers, etc. Trot must have successfully demonstrated that he had mastered all these skills of war, for in December 1916 he was formally appointed as an officer in His Majesty's Land Forces. And this is the actual document which confirms Trot's appointment as a second lieutenant in the infantry. It's dated from the 19th of December 1916, but presented to him on the 6th of January 1917. Note that the appointment says temporary. Many newly qualified officers at this time had only been recruited for the duration of the war, and at the end were expected to return to their previous occupation. It looks as if initially Trot was supposed to have joined the Dorsetshire Regiment, as the London Gazette indicates that this was his regiment. And here is a photo of Trot dressed in a uniform showing the collar lapels of the Dorset Regiment. So I guess it would have been taken around this time. This is probably what Trot would have wished, but as was common then, he was sent where needs were greatest at the time. Second Lieutenant Kellaway was therefore ordered to join the 12th Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment. At the start of 1917, the 12th Hampshires were not in France, but in Macedonia, a region in northern Greece. At that time, Britain was part of an alliance formed with France, Serbia and Greece against Bulgaria, who had allied with Germany and the Ottoman Turks. And the main defensive line had been established just north of the ancient port of Salonika, today known as Thessaloniki. To get to the Salonika front, Trot would most likely have had to take a ship to France, and then a slow train down to Marseille, where he would have embarked on a troop transport ship to Salonika. I found this postcard amongst Pop's belongings, and it's probably the ship that transported him from Marseille to Salonika. The Aquitania had originally been a luxury liner of before being converted to a troop ship and hospital ship in 1915. It could also have been the ship that later brought it back from Greece. The trip would have taken about a week if all went well. By this time, however, German U-boats had become quite a problem, and many British troops never made it to the front, instead ending up in a watery grave as their ships were sunk by this new menace of 20th century warfare. Fortunately, Trot seems to have made it safely to Salonika without incident. So this is a postcard of Salonika from 1916. It was a busy, bustling port made all the busier by the arrival of thousands of troops from France and Britain. Trot seems to have arrived here in early March 1917. Trot wouldn't have remained here long, however. The main battlefront was about 50 miles north near Lake Doiran, and this is where he would have been sent to join his new regiment, the 12th Battalion Hampshires. You can see from this map that the British were just part of the Allied force, which also comprised of Italians, French, Russians and Serbians, and later Greeks. By early 1917, the Allied forces were preparing to launch a counterattack on the Bulgarians, who were extremely well dug in, particularly around the British section near Lake Doiran. To find out what Trot would have been doing at this time, I made a trip to the Hampshire Regiment Museum in Winchester. They were really helpful and dug out the regimental diary, which gives a detailed account of what the 12th Hampshires were up to in the spring of 1917 near Lake Doiran in what is today North Macedonia. I'll read some of the excerpts from this account. The 12th Hampshire passed the first quarter of the year with little to vary the usual routine. They moved to and fro between front line and reserve at regular intervals. Both sides indulged in intermittent shelling, but the battalion's casualties had not reached double figures before it went back well behind the line in the second half of March for special training. After a fortnight in the camp, the battalion was in reserve behind the front, finding working parties for the Royal Engineers and continuing training, while its patrols examined the Jumo ravine, which an attack would have to cross. And then, after dark, on April the 23rd, the 12th moved up for the division's attack on the formidable positions it had so long been facing. So here are some photos of the formidable positions that the 12th Hampshires were facing. This one, taken in March 1917, shows a Bulgarian telephone station with trench telescope observing the British positions. Unlike the British, the Bulgarians had excellent communication systems with telephone wires well dug in to protect them from enemy shelling. The soldiers were also well dug in with extensive trench networks looking down from the hills onto any enemy attack. And this is a recent photo taken from inside the remains of an old Bulgarian bunker near Lake Doiran. You can see how thick the concrete is. These are the kinds of defences that the British forces were up against in 1917. And these were the guys that the British were up against. This is a colorized photo taken of Bulgarian soldiers manning the defences near Lake Doiran in 1917. 1917. They're probably members of the elite 9th Pleven Division, some of Bulgaria's toughest troops. And you can see that they're all brandishing hand grenades rather than rifles. Dr. Alan Wakefield, in his brilliant book Under the Devil's Eye, gives a vivid account of the Salonika campaign and the Battle of Doiran in 1917. And he notes the backbone of their defence was based on the machine gun and hand grenade, with support coming from artillery and trench mortars. You can also see the solid concrete defences and the date 1915 to 1917 etched onto the wall of the bunker. Bulgarian and German engineers have been working on these formidable defences since 1915, and also Bulgarian morale was extremely high. Their defensive position looked almost impregnable, and according to a German officer, Major Nedev, writing in his diary, the Bulgarians had been told that they must fight to the last drop of their blood in order to check the enemy, to break his attack, and thus to assure the future of Bulgaria. And here is the actual battle map used by my grandfather in April 1917, still in remarkably good condition, bearing in mind that he probably carried this map into battle with him on that day. You can see marked out in red the enemy trenches as far as they knew at the time. And I'll continue reading from the regimental diary. In this attack, the 79th Brigade was on the right from the lake to the Petit Couronne, which the Devons were again tackling. The 12th Hampshire's objective, 03, being east of the Petit Couronne and astride a wide gully, Wylai ravine or valley. On their right, the 7th Wiltshire were attacking 01 and 02 next to the lake. Nobody who had faced the Petit Couronne and the neighbouring defences for several months could have had any illusions about the desperate character of the venture. Our bombardment had done little damage to the formidable Bulgarian defences, their trenches having largely been blasted from the solid rock. The wire had not been effectively cut, and our guns had quite failed to master or silence those of the enemy. It is indeed difficult to understand how this sector should ever have been selected for an attack. Whatever the strategical arguments in favour of choosing it, without an overwhelming artillery superiority, which we did not possess, to have achieved success here against fighters as stubborn and skillful as the Bulgarians would have bordered on the miraculous. It was about the last place in the line where an attack promised to be successful. But General Sarai was insistent on it. It was not against French troops whom he was pitting. It was not French troops whom he was pitting against this position. And this is the photo of General Sarai, overall commander of the Allied forces on the Salonika front, discussing operations with General Milne, overall commander of the British forces. General Sarai's overall plan was to use the Serbian, French and Italian forces for the main thrust, with the British attack serving as a means of diverting Bulgarian forces away from the main Allied advance. However, it seems from Hampshire's regimental diary that the British thought that the French general was asking them to do the impossible, but he was not particularly concerned, as it was British soldiers' lives at stake and not French. The diary continues. By 8:15 p.m. on April the 24th, the 12th Hampshire started moving forward. to be caught by the enemy's barrage half an hour before 9:45 p.m. and so prevented from reaching their assembly position, a sunken road between Swindon and Silbury Hills, before our barrage lifted. When they did advance, they promptly came under very heavy fire. The steep and rocky sides of the narrow Jumeau ravine doubled the effect of the bursting shells, creating an absolute inferno. The Devon rear companies just ahead of the Hampshire were disordered and shattered. Being unable to advance, they blocked the way, and the ravine was soon congested with dead and wounded. The enemy's guns took full advantage of their chance and poured in shell after shell. Nevertheless, the Hampshire's right company somehow struggled gallantly forward, some officers and men actually getting through the wire and gaining a foothold in 03, only to have the Bulgarian barrage brought down on them and to be enfiladed from their right, where the Wiltshire had made only the slenderest lodgment near the lake. Colonel Coble endeavoured to bring the Hampshire's left company across to support the right, but there was no advancing through so intense and concentrated a barrage. Casualties were heavy. Colonel Coble himself was among the wounded, and while a handful in the enemy lines, unsupported and outnumbered, were killed or taken, the remnants of the battalion were driven back by the shelling to the sunken road, where they rallied. Captain Pryor now took command, and about 70 men were eventually collected here, with a smaller party on Rocky Knoll. Meanwhile, the Devon's leading companies had established themselves on the Petit Couronne and were holding on, but with both flanks exposed, could not maintain their precarious foothold, and they had to be ordered back. So what of Trot's experience during this desperate battle and horrific carnage? Well, he wasn't killed, unlike many of his comrades who lie buried in cemeteries near Lake Doiran today. We know he was wounded with a bullet wound to his right leg. It also looks as if he actually made it to the front lines of the enemy trenches, where he was involved in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. I say this because, although he rarely talked about his experience of the war, my mother recalled a time when he did open up a little. I guess it must have been after one of his frequent nightmares about the war, and my mother was with him, trying to reassure him, no doubt. But in his dreams he was still haunted by the memories of the bloody trench fighting at Doiran, of having to throw bombs into the enemy trenches where there was no time to take prisoners, and it was either kill or be killed. And the faces of those who had lost their lives, both friend and foe, would no doubt return to him in those nightmares until the day he died. And so the journal concludes its account of the battle. Still, though itself a disastrous failure, the 26th Division's attack had contributed to distract the enemy's attention from the 22nd, who had captured their objectives and retained them, despite counterattacks. But the 79th Brigade had been cut to pieces, the 12th Hampshire having 15 officers and 249 men hit. Captain Graham Montgomery, Lieutenant Jarvis, and Second Lieutenants Bench, Gibault and Tidy were missing, almost certainly killed. The CO, Captain Mitchell, Lieutenants Baker, Lewis and Stewart, and Second Lieutenants Biggar, Kellaway, Vincent and Wills being wounded. They had been asked to attempt the impossible. And so there we can see my grandfather's name for the first time, listed among the names of wounded officers, and his name appears again later in the journal in an appendix which sets out the list of officer casualties. Also taking part in the First Battle of Doiran, as it came to be known, was a young lieutenant called Edward Owen Rutter. He was with the Wiltshire Regiment, which was fighting alongside the Hampshire Regiment and trying to take Hill 02 without success. He went on to write the epic poem entitled The Song of Tired Arthur, which tells of the exploits of a young officer stationed in Salonika and is based on the experiences of himself and fellow officers. The poem is too long to appear in full here, but for an account of the battle from a soldier's perspective, it's well worth reading, and it describes very well what Trot would have gone through, particularly in terms of the heavy shelling and brutal trench fighting. I've included an excerpt from the poem which gives a poignant description of the aftermath of the battle. Had you been there when the dawn broke, had you looked from out the trenches, you'd have seen that Serbian hillside, seen the aftermath of battle, seen the scattered picks and shovels, seen the scraps of stray equipment, here and there a lonely rifle or a Lewis gun all twisted, seen the little heaps of khaki lying huddled on the hillside, huddled by the Bulgar trenches, very still and very silent. Nothing stirring, nothing moving, save a very gallant doctor and his band of stretcher bearers working fearless in the open, giving water to the dying, bringing in those broken soldiers. You'd have seen the sunlight streaming, and perhaps you would have wondered how the sun could still be shining, how the birds could still be singing, while so many British soldiers lay so still upon the hillside. So Trot was in actual fact one of the lucky ones and had been brought into the dressing station where his wound would have been treated and bandaged up, and we can see from his medical record that he'd received a gunshot wound to the right leg. Interestingly, we can also see from this record that he'd only been with the field force for 3 months before he'd been wounded. He most likely would have been taken from the dressing station by mule or carriage to the train station at Doiran, and from here he would have been taken by train to Salonika, where he would have been transferred by lighter to a waiting hospital ship. And from the medical record, we can see that he was transferred to the sick convoy on the same day that he had been brought into the dressing station, 25th of April, 1917. As indicated earlier, it's quite possible that it was the Aquitania that was the hospital ship that Trot was transferred to, as he had a postcard of this ship amongst his belongings. I found this photo of the interior of the Aquitania whilst being used as a hospital ship. As a sister ship to the Titanic, it was quite luxurious. I've looked hard, but I don't recognise my grandfather's face amongst the patients. But Trot wasn't out of danger yet. Only 10 days before, on the 15th of April, the troop ship RMS Arcadian, en route from Salonika to Alexandria, had been sunk by a U-boat with a loss of over 279 lives. Mercifully, with a possible stop at Malta, Trot made it home without incident. So, once safely back in Blighty, Trot would no doubt have had to spend some time recovering in a military hospital before being allowed to return home. My mother told me that there was a story in the family that as he slowly climbed out of the train at Maiden Newton Station, his horse, which had been grazing in a meadow at the farm, must have got wind of him and, in its excitement, pushed the field gate open and galloped up the road to meet him. After the hell of the Salonika front, what a relief it must have been for Trot to finally make it back in one piece to his home in the sleepy Dorset countryside. A place where he could try to heal both physically and mentally. His feelings must have been tinged, though, with sadness, as his mother was no longer there. At some stage, Trot would have been declared fit enough to return to duty. Fortunately for my grandfather, he was assigned to the 3rd Battalion Dorset Regiment, which was a training unit based in White Regis, Weymouth. And I'm guessing this would have been sometime towards the end of 1917. I'm also guessing that it was while he was stationed here that he met my grandmother, Muriel Wallace, who lived in Chesterfield Place on the seafront in Weymouth. And this is the earliest photo that I've been able to trace of her, and I guess this would have been taken about the time that Trot and Muriel would have started courting, as they used to say then. And among the family heirlooms, I also discovered this gold and tortoiseshell brooch featuring the badge of the Dorsetshire Regiment. Now, these brooches were known as sweethearts and were worn by mothers, wives and girlfriends of the men fighting in the war. And when holding this small brooch, it's kind of touching to think of the emotions Muriel must have felt. No doubt she would have worn this badge with a mixture of love and pride, as well as a dread at the thought that at any time this man she loved could be taken from her and sent back to the hell of the trenches, where his chances of survival would have been very slim. But luck was on their side. In the summer of 1918, Trot was promoted to first lieutenant, but instead of being ordered back to the trenches, he was told to pack his bags and get ready for his next posting, which was in India on the northwest frontier. Now, among Pop's belongings, I found this postcard of a transport ship, RMS Malwa, which was probably the ship that either transported him out to India or maybe back again. My cousin Joe inherited an album full of photos and postcards from the time that Pop was in India, and it was largely through these and a bit of online research that I was able to work out when and where Pop travelled to in India, and also gain insight into the kind of life he lived out there. This postcard shows the port of Alexandria in Egypt, where he would have stopped briefly. It's addressed to Muriel and dated 19th of August 1918, and simply says, "Love, Trot." I can imagine that Muriel, while delighted to hear that Trot was safe, may have felt a little crestfallen at the brevity of the message. We could blame this on the censors, I suppose, or maybe Trot was just not the romantic type. The next task was to find out where Trot was stationed in India and which regiment he was with. This is a photo taken of Trot with his fellow officers. Trot is standing on the left, third row up. But what's the regiment and where is he? Among Trot's things, I found these Christmas cards, dated Christmas 1918. They seem to suggest that he was with the 41st Dogras Regiment. A few searches online threw up this list of officers, of the 2nd Battalion, 41st Dogras, and there he is. It has him down as 2nd Lieutenant G.D. Kellaway, when it actually should be G.L. Kellaway, and his promotion to 1st Lieutenant was officially still pending. But there he is, along with his fellow officers, many of whom no doubt feature in the photo. Interestingly, it has the arrival date as 29th of August 1918. And below him on the list is Lieutenant W.J. Norris, formerly from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, who also arrived about the same time. Now, Lieutenant Norris was to become one of Trot's best friends, and they stayed in contact long after the war was over. According to the regimental diary, the 2nd Battalion 41st Dogras were based in Sialkot at this time, and this is borne out by photographs in Trot's album. Sialkot is a city just north of Lahore in the Punjab region of India, although today this area is part of Pakistan, of course. It's also close to the northwest frontier with Afghanistan. Initially, the plan seems to have been that the regiment would be joining the fighting in Macedonia. However, all plans were put on hold with the end of the war on the 11th of November 1918 and the signing of the armistice. Now, hearing this news, Trot no doubt thought that he would be soon heading back home to England. But as it turned out, it would be another year before he finally packed his bags and said goodbye to India. Judging from the collection of photos, Trot seems to have adapted well to life in Sialkot. This is a picture of either he or a friend relaxing at his bungalow. Coming from a farming background, Trot was no doubt only too keen to roll up his sleeves and do a bit of gardening, even though he would have had plenty of people to do that for him. And Pop always loved dogs, and he seems to have grown particularly attached to this one. Trot's photo album gives us an interesting glimpse of what life was like for a British Army officer of the Raj over 100 years ago. Note the picture of Trot's dog again, being washed this time. These are more pictures of people that Trot knew and who probably worked for him. And the man in the centre is the headman of a local village. The old black and white photos perhaps give the impression that Sialkot was a dreary place, but this modern photo, taken somewhere in the countryside near Sialkot, gives quite a different impression, with the glorious views of the distant Himalayas in the background. Trot was a competent horseman and would have certainly taken any opportunities he had to ride out to explore the nearby countryside. Trot's other means of transport seems to have been this tonga for getting around town. Tennis seems to have been a favourite pastime. Trot's on the right. Judging from his photos, Trot and his fellow officers certainly seem to have had some fun times. This picture shows them all carefree and happily relaxing over a cup of tea and a game of tennis. Most of these men, like Trot, had witnessed and somehow survived against all odds the horrors of the trenches. They were probably just happy to be alive, soon to be going home. But these happy, smiling faces belie underlying worries and concerns. The great influenza pandemic, sometimes known erroneously as Spanish flu, came to the Punjab in the autumn of 1918, although it seemed not to have impacted the European population living in the region to any large degree. For the local people, usually living in comparative poverty, the pandemic had devastating consequences. It's estimated that over 800,000 people died. That's around 4% of the population of the Punjab at that time. And there were reports of widespread social disarray, with homes and streets filled with the dead and dying. And the colonial administration seemed unable to do anything about it. The 41st Dogras were also affected, and the battalion diary records that there were over 40 deaths in the battalion in 1 month alone. At the same time, the local population of the Punjab were growing restless. This was partly as a result of the devastating flu pandemic, but also due to the continued repressive activities of the colonial administration, who were becoming increasingly worried about the rise of the nationalist movement throughout India. In Amritsar, which is only about 60 miles away from Sialkot, where Trot was stationed, news that some prominent local Indian leaders had been arrested sparked violent protests where buildings were set on fire. Several foreign nationals were killed by angry mobs, and a Christian missionary was severely beaten. So, in April 1919, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived in Amritsar and with orders to put down the rebellion. And on the 13th of April, a large crowd of around 10,000 people had gathered in a square to protest. And General Dyer arrived on the square with 50 soldiers and ordered them to open fire. They continued firing at the unarmed protesters for 10 minutes until their ammunition had run out. Afterwards, almost 400 people lay dead, including men, women, the elderly, and even children. Many more were wounded. The infamous event came to be known as the Amritsar Massacre. Fortunately, the 41st Dogras were not directly involved in the massacre at Amritsar. However, Trot and his regiment would have been put on high alert and would have been called upon to deal with any disturbances that might break out amongst the local population. Not surprisingly, following the Amritsar massacre, resentment to British rule in India grew even more intense and hostile. One incident that my grandfather did recall was particularly gruesome. One of the friendlier local members of staff suddenly disappeared for no apparent reason. He was never seen again, but some days later, the man's hand was discovered nailed to the door of the barracks. It was a warning. This is a photo from Trot's album, which appears to show him training a platoon of Dogras. This training was soon to be put to the test. On the 3rd of May 1919, Afghanistan invaded the British tribal area around Waziristan on the northwest frontier. It was the outbreak of what came to be known as the Third Anglo-Afghan War. On the 6th of May, the battalion was ordered to mobilise, and on the 23rd of May, they were sent by rail to Peshawar. And here they joined the 45th Infantry Brigade under General Dyer. And on the 28th of May, they received orders to relieve Tal, which was being besieged by enemy forces. And And according to the regimental diary, this involved a 20-mile march in blistering temperatures of up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 50 degrees centigrade, in the shade. On the 1st of June, the brigade entered Tulle and the enemy retreated. And on the 17th of June, the battalion left Tulle and were taken by train to Nowshera, where they remained until October the 7th. And this leaves me with a question. I'm not sure whether Trot was actually with the battalion when it was ordered to the northwest frontier. The reason I say this is that nowhere in my grandfather's photo album is there any mention of Nowshera. And according to the regimental diary, the battalion was based there for around 4 months. Now, one explanation of this lies in the fact that the battalion's depot had remained in Sialkot. Now, the depot would have looked after the main administration and training of recruits for the battalion. Now, this makes sense to me. Trot would have still been suffering to a certain extent from the effects of his leg wound in Salonika. So he would have struggled with long marches over challenging terrain such as the march to relieve Tulle. Besides, while with the Dorset Regiment in Weymouth, he had been involved in training. This was his expertise, and my guess is that was what he continued to do in Sialkot. I may be wrong, but I think he remained there with the depot. And the photo here would seem to bear this out too. In this photo, there are far fewer officers and more civilians or administrators. Trot is sat on the grass in the centre near the girl holding the dog. Now, Trot obviously spent some time in the beautiful hill station resort of Nainital, as it appears in his photo album. This is a postcard of Nainital from the album. And this is what the resort looks like today. As you can see, it's still a beautiful resort. What Trot was doing there, I don't know. His regiment was never posted there. It's a long way from Sialkot, 1,300 miles to be precise, up in the foothills of the Himalayas near the border with Nepal. Looking at the photos in his album, Trot seems to have enjoyed himself here. This is a photo of him rowing on the lake, and this picture shows him going for a stroll with a friend and his dog, which he seems to have brought from Sialkot. I think the most likely explanation as to why he was here was for a holiday, for a spell of leave and recreation, to get away from the intense summer heat in the Punjab. This lovely photo was also taken at Nainital. It shows Trot with his friend Bill Norris, dressed up as a clown, and another friend, all seemingly having a wonderful time. And presumably this was a show that Trot and his friends put on to entertain themselves, and is all the more evidence to show that the trip to Nainital was mainly for much deserved rest and recuperation, and have a good time. In October 1919, Trot's regiment moved to the beautiful city of Lahore. Trot was obviously impressed with the city, with all its temples and palaces. He took a lot of photos, a few of which I'm showing here. In early November 1919, Trot received the news that he'd been looking forward to. He was being demobilised. Trot's war had finally come to an end. There are quite a few photos in his album of friends he was with in India. I include some of them here. I don't know who they were, but they were obviously very special to Trot and a big part of his life at that time. All brothers in arms and sons and servants of the then British Empire of over 100 years ago. Bill Norris, shown here, would go on to become a lifelong friend, and he and his wife would often pay visits to Trot on his farm in Dorset right up until the 1950s. He was affectionately known by my mum and her sisters as Uncle Billy. At that time, it took 4 to 6 weeks to travel from India to England, so Trot must have finally arrived back in England in late December 1919, just in time for Christmas. And what a Christmas that must have been, with all the family reunited and the war finally over. But it must also have been a time tinged with sadness, as Trot's mother was no longer there to see her son's safe return. For now, though, Trot could just sleep, try to forget the horrors of war, and try to adjust to life back in England, and England at peace. But Muriel was still there, waiting for him, and the following year, in December 1920, they got married. They moved to Fareham in Hampshire, where Trot tried his hand at chicken farming and set up a farm shop. Although I think Trot's business was moderately successful, in the late 20s they moved back to Maiden Newton, where Trot bought some land at Froome Church and set up his own small chicken farm. He also built his own house, which was called Sunnyside, and it's still there today. It's just across the meadows from Crookston, so I'm guessing he was also involved in the family farming business there. Trot's father had died in 1928, so this may have been something to do with the move back to Dorset. My mother was born here in 1932 and recalled playing in the river with the local children. Trot's farming enterprise must have been reasonably successful, as his chickens frequently used to win egg-laying competitions. I still have these medals today. In 1938, Trot took on the tenancy of Hurst Farm at Malton, a mixed farm of dairy and arable, where he and Muriel settled down to raise a family of 4 wonderful daughters, one of whom, of course, was my mum. His brothers Jack and Archie were farming close by. This is a photo of them out together on a local shoot. When World War II broke out, Trot did his bit by volunteering as an ARP warden, and with Wartmore Airdrome close by, he would have had a busy time. Trot and Muriel spent the rest of their lives at Hurst, with Muriel passing away in 1960, and Trot sometime later in 1966. Some of their descendants still farm at Hurst today. But my research into Pop's story in World War I wasn't quite over. I wanted to literally retrace his footsteps on the battlefield, where he had so nearly lost his life. And if you, like me, are one of Pop's many descendants, well, our lives wouldn't even have started. Last year, I joined a trip to see firsthand the battlefield where my grandfather had nearly died, near Lake Doira, in what is now North Macedonia. We stayed in a hotel near the lake looking up to the hills where the Bulgarian defensive line had been. In these beautiful sunny days in April, with everything so green and flowers everywhere, it was hard to believe that these were the hills where there had been so much death and carnage over 100 years ago. And this is the view looking from the Bulgarian positions on the Grand Koran, or the Devil's Eye, as the British like to call it, looking out towards the Petit Coron and Hill 03, which was Trot's objective on the night of 24th of April 1917. As we know already, the attack ended in complete failure, with heavy casualties on the British side, and the Bulgarians remaining resolutely in place. And looking at the remains of Bulgarian bunkers, you could begin to see why the British bombardment of the enemy defences had been so ineffective. They were virtually bomb-proof, the concrete being so thick. The Bulgarians had had over a year to prepare their defences while they waited for the British to attack. Here you can see the remains of a Bulgarian trench dug deep into the rock, and all around these hills there would have been a honeycomb of bunkers and deep trenches like these. It's no wonder that the Hampshire's regimental diarist had recorded grimly that they'd been asked to attempt the impossible. The most moving day of the trip for me, though, was when we followed the approximate path that my grandfather's regiment, the 12th Hampshires, would have taken in their attempt to take Hill 03. In the background, you can see the Petit Coron, which the 10th Battalion Devonshire Regiment was tasked with taking, and to the right, Hills 01 and 02, which the 7th Wiltshires had been assigned to. As we made our way through the scrub, which would have been impossible without the assistance of a local guide, you came across unexploded shells. These were testament to the efforts the British artillery had gone to try and dislodge the enemy. How dangerous they still were, I don't know, but I tended to give them a wide berth. Some of them were not so obvious, and you had to be careful where you put your feet. I was told by the guide that every now and then there were scrub fires, particularly in the hot summer months, and then you could hear and see munitions exploding in the heat. But amongst the ugly debris of war, designed by man to deal out death and destruction, there was something else I noticed. Just like the poppies that sprang up on the former battlefields of Flanders, so here, springing up amongst the old trenches, were the most beautiful flowers. Nature's antidote almost to man's intent to destroy each other. Some might even say they represented the spirits of all those that perished here, fighting on these hillsides so long ago. And this is the moment that I had been waiting for. We had finally arrived at the foot of 03. Although at that time it would not have been covered by this dense scrub. This is me holding the very map that my grandfather, in all possibility, had carried with him on that night as he tried to lead his platoon through the hail of bullets and gunfire to try and seize this hill looming above me. It was somewhere not far from here that Pop had been hit and felled by one of those bullets. But miraculously, someone had picked him up and dragged him back to safety so that he would survive to tell the tale. Except that he didn't tell the tale. Like many old soldiers of that time, he rarely talked about the war. No doubt he had suffered from what we now call PTSD, and the memories of this time were no doubt just too painful and too horrific to recall. And like many others who managed to make it home, he probably suffered from a kind of guilt that somehow he had survived, but so many of his comrades had not. So I have tried to tell his tale because I think it needs to be told, and I don't think it should be forgotten. And as I turned to leave the hill, I noticed lying at my feet in the moss this perfectly preserved British 303 bullet, and I couldn't help wondering if the soldier who had fired this and made it safely back to Blighty? Or was he lying out there on the hillside in an unmarked grave, along with so many others of his brothers in arms who never made it home? And most poignant of all was walking through the row upon row of gravestones in the military cemeteries nearby, which, I should add, were all beautifully looked after. These stones show the names of men from the Hampshire Regiment who probably died as a result of wounds sustained in the same attack that Trot was involved in. He may well have known them. And looking out on the battlefield of Doiram, they erected a beautiful memorial to all those who gave their lives in the service of their country. It reads, "In glorious memory of 418 officers and 10,282 other ranks of the British Salonika Force who died in Macedonia and Serbia 1915 to 1918. And to commemorate 1,979 of all ranks who have no known grave, but whose names are on the panels. They did their duty, as did my grandfather and so many others of his generation."